The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Lighting Controls Podcast. We have a fantastic guest for you today, but before we jump into the conversation, let me take a minute to remind everyone today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association, and also Light Fair. We're very excited that Light Fair is back, and we will see you there very, very soon.
And this podcast is also financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Check out not our website, but check out the certification that we're working on through NAILD to try to get people who are unfamiliar with lighting controls up to some level of speed when it comes to lighting controls. We want to give people an opportunity to step into this really crazy, complex world, and we're creating a certification that gives you that leg up on other people, especially when it comes to distribution. But check it out. We're going to have a link in the description. And also, huge shout out to our sponsor for this episode. We could not do this without our sponsor's support. This time it's MaxLight, primarily their C-Max lighting controls platform, which is a true plug-and-play system. And I feel like that's a buzz term, true plug-and-play, but it really does mean we have a great episode where we talk to Umesh from MaxLight C-Max division, and he really talks about the interesting, unique, patented component, which is using a USB-C component that allows you to, add controls later on. You don't have to order fixtures with controls. So it really, again, you have a USB port on your fixture, plug your system right into that fixture, you're ready to go. It's really worth checking out. So check it out, MaxLight, maxlite.com/CMAX for C-Max. And again, huge thanks to them for sponsoring this episode. But let's get into it. So today we've got a great guest. Dan, do you mind just giving us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Dan Weissman. I'm an associate principal and the director of Lam Labs at Lam Partners. We're an independent lighting consultant firm. I am trained as an architect and registered as an architect, and have started working at Lam coming on 20 years ago this June, although I left for a number of years to go to graduate school, and I worked at an architecture firm for a while. And yeah, I don't know. We do a lot of all sorts of interesting, fun projects, and I also do a bunch of woodworking on the side. I got 2 kids. I bake a lot, bake bread.
Nice.
That'll be our. We watch a lot of Great British Bake Off. So.
For sure, that's a great show. But anyway, so I think that's really an interesting background that you have with the architectural side, especially coming into the permanent installation lighting consulting work. What of the skills that you picked up from the architectural, education that you took and the experience you had with the architectural firm really kind of translates over to lighting?
Well, at sort of a design scale, I think there's a lot to be said about sort of how we perceive space and how we understand relationships and hierarchies with, form making and spatial relationships. The big, I'll call it buzzword, but it's also sort of a core philosophy of our firm, and I think lighting design more generally, is the relationship between human perception and the luminous environment, and sort of how we perceive the world around us through light, and how that's sort of at the core of what we're doing, as not just picking fixtures for some decorative application, but crafting luminous environments for people to spend their lives in.
Absolutely. And so, I think that really is an interesting overlap. A lot of architects kind of think of lighting as this kind of mysterious magic force that just kind of permeates the space. And
right.
I've dealt with a couple of architects who just kind of up the aperture on their renderings, and then it's like, oh yeah, I've got enough light, and it's like, where is that light coming from?
Yeah, hidden
um,
point
but
sources.
right, exactly. But I mean, from that perspective, I mean, there's also the aspect of control for that illumination, because it's not just like everything's on one zone and pushed to 100%. So I would imagine that that also leans into how you think about the controls design too.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say, like, for many projects, we, especially as energy codes have gotten more prescriptive, the sort of the typical space types have become less concerning, and not a lot of thought needs to be put into a basic open office space or an office space,
Right.
or a classroom where there's going to be a couple switches on the wall, there's going to be a couple automatic controls, there's going to be some photo cells for daylight control, there's going to be occupancy sensors. Electrical engineer is more than capable to handle all that without any of our oversight. I remember back early when I first started, like, putting together controls diagram narrative content that had to, like, explicitly lay out all those different types of automatic controls, and now that's just sort of run of the mill. So I think where we start to provide more insight is in spaces where things are atypical, where there's potentially a lot of spaces. Actually, I've done a couple food halls recently that one of them is not very big. It's here in Cambridge. I still actually haven't gone since it's opened, but apparently it's doing great business. Small space, not a ton of fixtures, but like 30 zones in this 1,000 square foot space, and like just having a lot of nuance and capability to tune things for day one, I think, is something that, with the current capacity of typical digital control systems, has just become a sort of a standard fare. But with that level of control comes the need to think about how to actually design those controls.
Totally, but I mean, just to kind of walk back to something you mentioned, you say that the engineer kind of takes responsibility of the kind of bread and butter spaces, and so is that the typical relationship that you have, that it's really only the bespoke, unique conditions that you get involved in when it comes to lighting controls, or do you also facilitate the bread and butter stuff?
Well, one, it depends on the project. It depends on the client. There's a couple variables that depends on the electrical engineer. Like, some electrical engineers want to be totally hands off and don't have aren't willing to, like, give any feedback. But we are rarely scoped to do full controls design, just because it just doesn't make sense, because we're not stamping engineering drawings. I mean, I personally am not remotely an engineer.
Sure.
Well, there are some people that are registered engineers in our office. They're not legally allowed to do that from our, from an insurance standpoint, right? So, like, there's a certain amount of ownership that an electrical engineer is going to, by default, have to be responsible for. And frankly, for a lot of projects that are run-of-the-mill-ish, most of that tends to just be like providing a narrative and the most basic of stuff in the drawings, and then passing it off to one of the big control manufacturers and letting them do all the, like, nitpicky design anyways. So it's usually what ends up happening is standard content is put out by the engineer. The controls manufacturer will put together a submittal. Electrical engineer will review the submittal for engineering conformance, and then we'll review it for sort of conceptual conformance, right? Like, are the zones that we suggested laid out correctly? Are they showing switch locations in the place that the architect wants them to be? And if not actually suggesting that, at least, like, calling it out to the architect to be like, make sure that this is in the right place. Usually it comes with a bit of overthinking. as I find is common. And
Sure.
like, I just saw a project last week where like I put together, and the missing piece of this is that for spaces that are beyond the most basic,
Mhm.
we usually put together some sort of controls matrix, right? So like
Hmm.
listing out
Mhm.
all the different zones that we want to see in the space and which fixtures are in which zones, and then either which wall switches those are associated with or which scenes those are associated with. And especially with a four button keypad becoming so common as a control device for simple scene based control, like we do that a fair amount.
Mhm.
But I find like I went to a project where we had a 4-button keypad. There was maybe 5 or 6 zones in this room, and I can just tell you after being in there's no way anybody's going to fuss around with the different scenes. Like it's going to be all on, it's going to be everything at 50%, or it's going to be off. Like
Right.
there's no way that they're going to take advantage of like all the nuance that could be built. And I think that's been a big learning experience for us with a lot of standard, more sort of day use
Mhm.
spaces in general,
Hmm.
is that like all of a sudden controls manufacturers offer all these capabilities, but the fact is that most people just want a basic simple light switch with a raise low or a dimmer
Right.
switch on the wall. Like fancy controls, nobody knows how to use them. They're always a pain in the ass. They're always bypassed for just the most simple things. And I will say the most successful projects that I've had are the ones that have simple controls in most spaces and people find them easy to use.
Mhm.
Um, and then it's really like the specialty spaces, the public spaces where there might be something more special going on, whether it's something
Mhm.
that's just a lot of zones or there's dynamic lighting, color changing, or tunable white or something. And that tends to be more of a contained subset of a project. That's rarely going to
Mhm.
be the entirety of our projects, except for like a super specialty project that is all about that thing.
Right. Like a
Yeah,
museum or something.
Yeah, but even then, like, I mean, I just have a museum under construction right now that they couldn't really afford to do anything fancy. We've got one fixture that's DMX controlled, but it's still white light only, so that they can run a show with like audio, and as the audio is
Mhm.
playing, different things in the what is it, the exhibition light up
Yeah.
differently.
yep,
But like that's
yep.
a one-off. The rest of it's just like simple
Right.
white light track light on and a bank of switches in the back of house so that they can manually tune things, and then like set it and forget it, and just it just runs its schedule control.
Yeah, we've talked to
Um,
so many different people, and it does seem like it's very often, uh, it does seem to fall back to having something very simple on the front end. You can have the most complicated control system on the back end, but if that
yeah,
end user experience isn't simple and easy, like you said, people just get confused. They throw it
right,
away.
yeah,
They don't want to touch it. There's a 4-button switch on the wall, but depending on how that switch was labeled, not labeled, people don't know what those buttons do. Staff turns over. It has to be simple. You guys set the lighting scene for most, right? You've set this. This is the preset. You come in, you push the preset. You want it up a little, you
right,
want it down a little. Here you go. Right? That's in most cases.
exactly.
That's yeah.
Right. And I have on more than one occasion developed a little diagram that the owner can put up next to the 4-button preset, so that the users know which button is which, so that they don't have to pre-engrave the buttons. As all the manufacturers want you to be able to pre-engrave, but like things change, they don't want to pay for it, it gets put in after the fact, whatever, and like especially for a space where maybe the preset system is actually like not back a house, but like not like when you walk in the room, but it's really designed for like, say it's for a
Mhm.
classroom and it's for the teacher only. A
Mm.
little diagram goes a long way.
No, I think that that's actually quite sharp, and I just want to highlight this for our listeners because they might not realize what you're talking about. You're basically just taking a piece of paper and sticking it to the left or right of the
Yeah.
switch that says, this is what this switch does, this is what this switch does, so that you don't have to pre-engrave everything. So you don't have daytime. What does daytime mean? And so
you're missing one very
exist.
important. You're missing one very important
Please.
factor. The paper needs to be laminated.
All right, fair enough. So it's a laminated, diagram that's there, so it can't get marred, it can't get crumpled up and thrown away, and it kind of exists there until they're ready to actually pull the trigger and say, okay, we're ready for full engraved switches. We know how to use these.
Which they never are going to do.
Never.
I
do.
can get
sure.
Nobody does.
Yeah.
Nobody does. Although, which is funny, but and the funny thing about this is that from one of my earliest memories of architectural education is if you need signs in your building telling the user what to do, where to go, how to feel, blah blah blah, you failed as an architect. And yet we're in a position where we exist in architectural spaces that are complicated, and how to run your building is hard, especially when there's lots of different users. When if it's your home or if it's your classroom that you're always teaching, and you get to know those things intimately, but for users that are transient, making those things simple and easy to understand is of critical importance. And
it's like the TV remote issue. I mean, you can have buttons for everything, but then it's going to be way too complicated. Whereas if you have a little Roku remote, it's got 5 buttons on it, and that's all you need.
I was gonna say the same thing about Roku. I mean, I totally agree. Except for the fact that they went and added Netflix and all the other ones down at the bottom. But who uses Sling TV? You can edit that out.
No, we'll leave that in. That's a great dig. But I mean, for sure, those buttons aside, it's just a directional button, a back, a home, and that's it. And so, really kind of making things concise and simplistic enough so that the end users can access what they need to access, but not necessarily give them the keys to everything.
Right.
I think
I will say the one other thing that I have not been very happy with all of the sort of commercial level lighting control manufacturers is, and this might be seen as a small gripe, but I think it has a nice parallel with the overabundance of screens in cars of late, is the loss of the haptic dimming controller, a dial or a slider, something physical that gives you a intimate sort of relation to the body, that as you move the thing, it dims. Pressing a button is not as intuitive, it's not as immediate, it doesn't sort of register in the same way. You never you don't know how many times you need to press it, if you're just supposed to press it or if you're supposed to hold it, and it's a little thing that I think goes a long way. And I totally appreciate the realities of a wireless switch and the cost, the power requirements, the use over time, fatigue of the object. And if there was if there's ways to do that better, I would. It's an industrial design problem, but
totally. But I mean, I think we are in a period where we've lost one of those haptic components, which is the slide dimmer. The slide is not code compliant, and so as a result, you can't have slide dimmers in most places because you need to have automated dimming response. Now, if you get a slide that's on a soundboard where it magnetically moves around and responds automatically, that would be awesome. But that, to your point, it would be incredibly expensive industrial design wise.
I mean, I think I have seen some of the ones where it's just a touch thing and there's a little LED indicator. And there's ways to do that. But by and large, it's a bit of a bummer that's not as well. I guess it's not code compliant anymore.
Yeah, all right. That is unfortunately part of the problem. But like you said, we do see a lot more screens on projects in general, and I think it's partially because you can fit more on a screen. It's easier
Sure.
to customize the screen for the user, put text on it, just be able to provide multiple user levels, which you can't do with a single button station, right? So we are seeing more screens in that regard. The other big problem that I tend to have with a lot of button stations is unless they're fully backlit, engraving the keys does you zero good in the dark,
It's
right?
totally, and also they're so small anyways, like nobody can read it.
Right.
But yeah, agreed. Like if you're walking into a dark room and there's no automated controls, you're lost.
Yeah.
But enough about manual wall switches.
Well, there was something else that you mentioned that I think might be interesting to our listeners, which was, in that museum you were talking about, you had one DMX fixture, and that was it.
Right.
And what do you do in a situation where you have just one DMX fixture? How does the design of the system kind of evolve around that, or is it more of like a tack on to the system?
Well, luckily, I'm not responsible for that scope because there was an exhibition designer that was responsible for figuring all that integration out.
Nice.
But I will tell you, it's basically a tack on to the system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure how they're doing it for that. And by that I mean,
there's basically some kind of integration handshake that goes on between a DMX system and your architectural system.
And that's how it usually happens. And I can speak to a whole range of other projects we've done where we do have a small standalone DMX system that sits as sort of a subset of full, BMS or at least a network control system where the usually what we do is we'll set up a couple scenes in the DMX system and then with an IO trigger have the master network control system trigger those scenes if it needs to be, or the subsystem just runs its own thing independently, and it's it's sort of sequenced in parallel.
Sure. Yeah, and just for people who aren't familiar with IO input output, it's just like either a contact closure or something to that effect, where it's a very simple command.
Yeah, so it's common where we'll have a little bit of color changing in a project that's by and large not. So, for example, a really awesome project we recently finished out at Williams College, the Williams College Davis Center, we added a bit of color changing at the exterior and also in the front rooms and the lobby of the interior right inside so that the school can have a couple different colors standard or running through on a slow fade. They can choose between a couple different ones in a very simple way. I think we ended up with a Nicolati. I don't think it was a Pharos on that project. But basically that it will automatically run through a series of shows on a night-to-night basis and nobody has to touch it. But if they want to go in, if they want to change it to party mode, it's a very simple thing to just press the button and deal with. And then the master control system will turn it off at 11 o'clock or whatever they determine the curfew of it is. So
even in that instance where you have just something simple like a Nicolati stick, for people who aren't familiar, it's a very simple wall mount, right? Lighting controller that many different manufacturers resell as their own, but they're all made by Nicolati, right? So when you do have something like that, and say you have, I don't know, Lutron or whatever else is the other main system that's operating everything, how do you deal with sort of the startup of all of those things, right? Do you because obviously if you've got one manufacturer doing one, someone else has to do Nicolati. Do you guys tackle that in-house because it's such a simple controller, or how do you guys normally approach small
actually
projects
not
like
usually that? Usually the for a single line, like say there's on the Williams project where there was one manufacturer that provided the color changing and their rep agency provided the color or the DMX controls to align with that, I think.
Got it.
So it's either that or the manufacturer has their own system that they can provide. Maybe that's what it was. I don't remember. Either way, they're going to provide system startup and commissioning for that little bitty system. independently, and if it's Lutron, they'll have their commissioning agents go out and do the rest of the building, and there may be a little need to have some crosstalk, and usually there's some amount of coordination that has to happen there. But for a simple thing, system like that, this was the kind of thing where like all the lighting was basically being controlled as one set of like one pixel, basically, right? Like there wasn't even like sub pixeling down the line. It was tape light, basically. So not a lot of complexity to that. On the flip side, something like a pixel based rope light detail,
like a pixel map
or
something.
Yeah, something where there's actually some more mapping that needs to happen. We'll have more involvement, but more often than not, that commissioning is done by the manufacturer's agent or by the reps in-house, just because the amount of times that we've worked on projects that are complex enough that they need an external integrator is much more rare. And those types of projects tend to, either we're like making a strong argument for somebody like, I think it's this company called Port Lighting. I don't remember. Like they're
For those
an integrator.
who don't know, Ron's company is Port Lighting.
So we will make the argument to the design team and ultimately the owner that they should bring on an integrator to help with the facilitation of all the different systems. But that tends to be for larger projects that are more complicated, that have multiple manufacturers that are being supplied that all have dynamic control capabilities. Like most of the architectural work, at least that I've done, hasn't been of that level, in sort of smaller projects. And we're really talking more like, stadium level or arenas or things like that, where like it would be impossible for us to take that on internally. That being said, we do have a couple folks in the office that have more of that skill set now. There's a guy in our Denver office who has a theater background and knows how to do more of a do a plot layout for a simple stage performance lighting situation, for example. So we've talked about offering some more robust integration services, but at least from my experience, like it can get very complicated very quickly, and I prefer to leave it to somebody who's specializing in it full time.
Yeah, well, and I think that is something that we hear a lot too, is basically, there's a line that exists where you can walk right up to, but you don't want to cross over, because then you're going to take on a huge layer of responsibility that you're not prepared for. And, is there a clear indicator? Like, is there something that you would see in scope that you would basically say, whoa, we're not taking that on?
So one of the funny things about this is that it's often hard for us to anticipate it when, like, say we get an RFP in for a project that's a typical architectural type project. We may not be clued into, or maybe nobody in the design team really understands that may be something that gets included in the project until after the project gets going. I guess my personal threshold would be, as soon as you cross from like one manufacturer supplying all the dynamic lighting hardware, to multiple manufacturers supplying dynamic hardware, and they don't all necessarily talk together cleanly, that's like a really good indicator. If it's a scale.
Yeah, if you have Max Light and Lutron, they don't natively communicate together. But if you have Crestron and why am I forgetting the DMX groups? Pharos. Crestron and Pharos work together, so they have that collaboration, so you don't necessarily need to worry about that scope. But
but I guess I would even go from at the fixture level. Like if all of your lighting hardware is being supplied by Lumen Pulse, then Lumen Pulse and Lumen Pulse's rep wherever they are, can manage coordinating that control system startup and commissioning up to a certain point. As soon as you start including multiple lighting manufacturers into the package with not a clear delineation of who is taking responsibility for the controls of all that, that's when, in my mind, you want to bring on a third party. The other obvious element would be from a scale one, right? Like if you just have if it's just a big project and there's a lot of hardware and there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen, and I think actually another really good indicator is more than 1 to 2 universes worth of DMX.
Interesting. So basically the 3 benchmarks here are if you're mixing multiple brands, not just controls brands, but fixture brands. If your scale goes beyond a certain size or amount of equipment, I mean, I'm sure that's a much more amorphous amount, and you just kind of get a sixth sense. But let's just put a number down, like 25,000 square feet or something like that. And once it hits above that threshold, you're probably going to need somebody involved. And then if you have, sorry, what was the last one there?
Amount of addresses.
Addresses, right. Universe. So DMX has 512 addresses per universe. So if you're above 2 universes of DMX, you probably should consider getting somebody involved as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good series of benchmarks. But I've had good success working directly with the commissioning agent for some of these different manufacturers, like Luminpulse, for example, and they have people on staff that know the Pharos software pretty well, and I'll get on a Zoom call and we'll design out a couple scenes for a project, and to sort of work it out in real time, as opposed to I mean, we can write narratives till we're blue in the face, but at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of you got to just get in there and do the work.
Right.
And what I've found at times is if you just write a narrative and for that to get translated into a really robust, well executed dynamic scene, it's going to be a hard sell unless the person on the other end really has an intuition for these things.
Well, and I think that's also a really good distinction right there, because you can have the most thorough documentation ever, but there's still things that get lost in translation. Whereas if you actually sit down with a technician and go over what the expectations are and actually in real time see it responding and how they're editing it, you can actually really do a lot of excellent work that way. It takes a little extra effort, and it does require you to have those contacts, but that is sort of something that a lot of people kind of shirk when it comes to that kind of coordination, because they go, oh, well, it's all in my documents, I'm good.
And the other thing that we've done a fair amount of late, because we have the digital rendering capabilities for it, is rendering different options for client review. That it can include different color changing scenes. We can do animations, and this is all photometrically accurate. So we're not just sort of showing, color splotches on photoshopped renderings. We actually show sort of the impact of the light performatively, as well as with color and color changing. So that's been very helpful to help with the sort of the dialogue and the communication aspect.
Yeah, the renderings like that, anything that's photometrically accurate does tremendously help. But I'd love to get your opinion on, just because I always struggle with this, how do you guys deal with having photometrically accurate renderings with glass? How do you deal with that with client expectations, especially on a new build where you can't just go do a demo?
In what regard?
Well, like if it's a
Like,
new build and there's no glass yet, right? Right, and building's not there. How do you deal with
yeah.
getting photometrically accurate renderings on the glass as far as like how it's actually going to be perceived based on glass coatings and all that?
Well, I mean, first of all, the photometric software, the software that we use can render glass to a pretty high level of fidelity. If you spend, I mean, even at the most basic, will look reasonably realistic, and has the index of refraction included. You can put coatings on. We don't tend to get too fussy with those things, and the you know as much as we've come to rely on digital software for a lot of our work, there is no substitute for the real experience. And I think,
Yeah.
at a certain point, if the quality of glass uh, has a big impact on the design, then you got to do
Hmm.
mock-up, no question. I mean,
Right.
you just got to get into real back into reality and test it out.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just relying on far field photometry and a lot of assumptions that may or may
Right.
not be truth to
Well, and
how
I
the
think,
real world works.
the unfortunate thing about, and to kind of open up the kind of guts of how IES files and photometry work, basically, if you have a color changing strip that has alternating diodes where you have red, green, blue, white, and it just repeats that pattern, you're actually not going to see what that reflection looks like in accuracy, because the way the photometry works is it treats it as a single source, and so you're
Right.
not actually going to see the striation, you're not going to see any of
Right.
that. And so really having the full scale model is going to be the only way you can see how those colors are going to interact.
Now, technically, we do have the capacity to model every single one of those LED diodes if you really wanted to get into
Sure.
the weeds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because with a physically based rendering software, you can model down to the diode if you wanted to, but nobody
Mhm.
ever does that. I mean, that's great. I mean,
Right.
unless you're like
That's a
doing a
huge
really small study.
right.
The good news is that it's much less often that we're using like you know cheap tape light with diodes spaced so far apart that you're rendering each one of those colors individually, as opposed to
Right.
quad chips or
Yeah.
and also like you use the physical mock-up to assess like how close you can get to a surface with all
Yeah.
those criteria in mind, and then you use the digital assessment for the larger scale, the in context, to look at different scenes of color changing. We were working with an artist last year where, you know, we were looking at different color combinations for an art piece where, we're using, pixel tape, but they want to have a really constrained aesthetic for the piece.
Mm.
So developing a couple color fades with, not super precise, but like reasonably precise color selections for the fade, sort of these ombre aesthetics, so that when it came time to actually do the programming, we could just give the renderings to the commissioning agent, and they could program in these
Mm.
RGB values straight off
Nice.
as a starting point. And then if there's some tweaking that needs to happen, fine. But like, they're not starting from scratch, and they're not just reading a
Right.
narrative about like, we want it to fade from 24 comma 79 comma 255 to whatever.
Right. No, but I think that that's actually a really good option for people if you can recreate it in a virtual environment, because you have no way of accessing the full scale model,
Yeah, yeah,
and use that as a way of communicating. I think that that makes perfect sense. So there are other ways to communicate outside of just script.
Right.
Instead of just typing it out, you can show, you can draw, you can record, you can do whatever is
right.
necessary to communicate that information, and then hand that over to the manufacturer or the technician. We're almost out of time here, but I just want to kind of encapsulate what we talked about here, because it's really interesting stuff. That I mean, as a lighting designer, you really do kind of get this perspective where you're trying to give guidance, but not necessarily guidance in every single facet, like, you know, the tiny little back of house janitor closet that has a single light fixture. You know, that's, you know, that you just need to meet code in most cases for that. So you don't need to worry. You don't need to hover over that. And it's uncommon for you to be hired to do that anyways. So that's
Right.
more of the engineer's responsibility to take on. It's more when you start getting into these custom spaces like lobbies and entertainment venues and all that. That's when your skill set really comes into play, to making sure that not only the control system is going to meet your requirements, but also that you can start thinking through, how are you going to be programming all of this? You know, what intensity values are things going to be at? What colors? Is there going to be some kind of phenomenal experience with a pixelated array? And then finding a way to communicate that to the people who are going to be programming the system in the end. And so all of these skills are really unique to your responsibility in this role. And so it kind of plays on this question that Ron and I always ask, is who should be responsible for the lighting controls design? And I think that that responsibility is kind of a shared responsibility from what you're saying here, because, you know, it's sort of like, what is the requirement of the project when it comes to the lighting controls? Is there this artistic quality that needs to be done, or is it really just the most generic energy code compliant application? In which case, you know, who takes on the responsibility is a little bit more easier to pick out. But then additionally, it's not just about the design work, it's also about the integration and the support from third parties. And so there is this sort of benchmarking that you have that says, okay, I will go up to this point and help guide and coordinate and all of that, but somebody else needs to take on the rest of this project to be able to ensure that it's done correctly, because I can't do that. I can't go out with a screwdriver and terminate every little low voltage wire. So this is a team effort when it comes to lighting controls design.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the one other piece that I would add is both as the sort of the bridge to the client, owner, end user, whoever, and sort of the in a way we're sort of like the interpreter, right? Because
Yep.
you know, oftentimes there's language that the commissioning agent and the technical folks are using that the owner has no clue about. The architect is definitely out to lunch on, like, and while they may be outside of our skill set, we need to be fluent in the language to be able to have an effective and high level conversation about it. Basically, to like, for example, like I know enough to be dangerous with a simple Faro system. Like I know what a TPC is, I know what an LPC is, I know what these devices do and what they mean, and you know how you load up addresses in universes, and like understanding those basics goes a long way to facilitating, you know, a successful project, I think. You know, we don't need to know all the nuances and all the programming language, but we need to know enough to have a effective communication with those that do, and then be able to communicate it back to the people that are actually hoping to just have a wonderful luminous environment.
Right. No,
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
communication really is the one of the most strongest roles that people take on as lighting designers.
Yeah.
And I think as that liaison, that's where, at least, you know, that's where renderings, I think, really play such a big part as that liaison, because you're able to show the client, help them realize their vision, see your vision for their space and their, you know, what you've interpreted as their vision, and then also
Right.
be able to provide that back to the programmers, to those commissioning agents, to those integrators, to say this is the vision. And it's not just in text, it's not just, you know, on a two-dimensional drawing. You can provide that rendering and really provide context behind what this space is and what it means to everybody, and what the owner's really looking for and what you're looking for. And there's a lot to be said for putting together the time to put together those renderings, and like you said, not just a basic Photoshop. Take those IES files, spend the time, and actually create those renderings so everyone is on the same page and can get behind what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for your time today, man. Really appreciate you coming on for us. And yeah, I will just start to close us out and remind everyone today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association, and Light Fair. We will see you there in just a few short months.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And check out information on the certification by NAILD, the lighting specialist in controls. There's going to be a link in the description if you want to learn more about it. It's a really great opportunity if you're new to the industry or you're focused in the distribution channels and want to kind of take that next step when it comes to lighting controls. Check it out. And huge shout out to our sponsor for this episode. We could not do this without your support, Max Light, especially their CMAX platform. Really great option for those easy to install, easy to program solutions that you really just want to have a plug and play option for your lighting controls platform. Check them out at maxlight.com/CMAX. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dan, really appreciate you coming on. This was a great conversation.